Chapter 37, The Innocents Abroad. We anchored here at Yalta, Russia, 2 or 3 days ago. To me, the place was a vision of the Sierras, the tall, gray mountains that back it, their sides bristling with pines, cloven with ravines, here and there a hoary rock towering into view, long, straight streaks sweeping down from the summit to the sea, marking the passage of some avalanche of former times, and all these were as like what one sees in the Sierras as if the one were a portrait of the other. The little village of Yalta nestles at the foot of an amphitheater which slopes backward and upward to the walls of the hills, and looks as if it might have sunk quietly down to its present position from a higher elevation. This depression is covered with great parks and gardens of noblemen, and through the mass of green foliage the bright colors of their palaces bud out here and there like flowers. It is a beautiful spot. We had the United States consul on board, the Odessa consul. We assembled in the cabin and commanded him to tell us what we must do to be saved, and tell us quickly. He made a speech. First thing he said fell like a blight on every hopeful spirit. He had never seen a court reception. 3 groans for the consul. But he said he had seen receptions at the Governor General's in Odessa, and had often listened to people's experiences of receptions at the Russian and other courts, and believed he knew very well what sort of ordeal we were about to essay. Hope budded again. He said we were many. The summer palace was small, a mere mansion. Doubtless we should be received in summer fashion in the garden. We would stand in a row, all the gentlemen in swallow-tail coats, white kids, and white neckties, and the ladies in light-colored silks or something of that kind. At the proper moment, 12 meridian, the Emperor, attended by his suite, arrayed in splendid uniforms, would appear and walk slowly along the line, bowing to some, saying 2 or 3 words to others. At the moment his Majesty appeared, a universal, delighted, enthusiastic smile ought to break out like a rash among the passengers, a smile of love, of gratification, of admiration, and with one accord the party must begin to bow, not obsequiously, but respectfully and with dignity. At the end of 15 minutes the Emperor would go in the house, and we could run along home again. We felt immensely relieved. It seemed, in a manner, easy. There was not a man in the party but believed that with a little practice he could stand in a row, especially if there were others along. There was not a man but believed he could bow without tripping on his coat tail and breaking his neck. In a word, we came to believe we were equal to any item in the performance except that complicated smile. The consul also said we ought to draft a little address to the Emperor and present it to one of his aides de camp, who would forward it to him at the proper time. Therefore, 5 gentlemen were appointed to prepare the document, and the 50 others went sadly smiling about the ship, practicing. During the next 12 hours we had the general appearance, somehow, of being at a funeral, where everybody was sorry the death had occurred, but glad it was over, and where everybody was smiling and yet broken hearted. A committee went ashore to wait on His Excellency, the Governor General, and learn our fate. At the end of 3 hours of boding suspense, they came back and said the Emperor would receive us at noon the next day, would send carriages for us, and would hear the address in person. The Grand Duke Michael had sent to invite us to his palace also. Any man could see that there was an intention here to show that Russia's friendship for America was so genuine as to render even her private citizens objects worthy of kindly attentions. At the appointed hour, we drove out 3 miles and assembled in the handsome garden in front of the Emperor's palace. We formed a circle under the trees before the door, for there was no one room in the house able to accommodate our 80 persons comfortably, and in a few minutes the imperial family came out, bowing and smiling, and stood in our midst. A number of great dignitaries of the empire in undress uniforms came with them. With every bow his Majesty said a word of welcome. I copy these speeches. There is character in them, Russian character, which is politeness itself, and the genuine article. The French are polite, but it is often mere ceremonious politeness. A Russian imbues his polite things with a heartiness both of phrase and expression that compels belief in their sincerity. As I was saying, the Czar punctuated his speeches with bows. Good morning. I am glad to see you. I am gratified. I am delighted. I am happy to receive you. All took off their hats, and the consul inflicted the address on him. He bore it with unflinching fortitude, and then took the rusty looking document and handed it to some great officer or other, to be filed away among the archives of Russia in the stove. He thanked us for the address, and said he was very much pleased to see us, especially as such friendly relations existed between Russia and the United States. The Empress said the Americans were favorites in Russia, and she hoped the Russians were similarly regarded in America. These were all the speeches that were made, and I recommend them to parties who present policemen with gold watches as models of brevity and point. After this, the Empress went and talked sociably, for an Empress, with various ladies around the circle. Several gentlemen entered into a disjointed general conversation with the Emperor. The dukes and princes, admirals and maids of honor, dropped into free and easy chat with first one and then another of our party, and whoever chose stepped forward and spoke with the modest little Grand Duchess Marie, the Czar's daughter. She was 14 years old, light haired, blue eyed, unassuming and pretty. Everybody talks English. The Emperor wore a cap, frock coat, and pantaloons, all of some kind of plain white drilling cotton or linen, sported no jewelry or any insignia whatever of rank. No costume could be less ostentatious. He is very tall and spare, and a determined looking man, though a very pleasant looking one nevertheless. It is easy to see that he is kind and affectionate. There is something very noble in his expression when his cap is off. There is none of that cunning in his eye that all of us noticed in Louis Napoleon's. The Empress and the little Grand Duchess wore simple suits of foulard or foulard silk, I don't know which is proper, with a small blue spot in it. The dresses were trimmed with blue. Both ladies wore broad blue sashes about their waists, linen collars, and clerical ties of muslin, low-crowned straw hats trimmed with blue velvet, parasols, and flesh-colored gloves. The Grand Duchess had no heels on her shoes. I do not know this of my own knowledge, but one of our ladies told me so. I was not looking at her shoes. I was glad to observe that she wore her own hair, plaited in thick braids against the back of her head, instead of that uncomely thing they call a waterfall, which is about as much like a waterfall as a canvas-covered ham is like a cataract. Taking the kind expression that is in the Emperor's face and the gentleness that is in his young daughters into consideration, I wondered if it would not tax the Czar's firmness to the utmost to condemn a supplicating wretch to misery in the wastes of Siberia if she pleaded for him. Every time their eyes met, I saw more and more what a tremendous power that weak, diffident schoolgirl could wield if she chose to do it. Many and many a time she might rule the autocrat of Russia, whose lightest word is law to 70 millions of human beings. She was only a girl, and she looked like 1,000 others I have seen, but never a girl provoked such a novel and peculiar interest in me before. A strange, new sensation is a rare thing in this humdrum life, and I had it here. There was nothing stale or worn out about the thoughts and feelings the situation and the circumstances created. It seems strange, stranger than I can tell, to think that the central figure in the cluster of men and women chatting here under the trees like the most ordinary individual in the land was a man who could open his lips and ships would fly through the waves, locomotives would speed over the plains, couriers would hurry from village to village, 100 telegraphs would flash the word to the four corners of an empire that stretches its vast proportions over a seventh part of the habitable globe, and a countless multitude of men would spring to do his bidding. I had a sort of vague desire to examine his hands, to see if they were of flesh and blood like other men's. He was a man who could do this wonderful thing, and yet if I chose I could knock him down. The case was plain, but it seemed preposterous. Nevertheless, as preposterous as trying to knock down a mountain or wipe out a continent. If this man sprained his ankle, 1,000,000 miles of telegraph would carry the news over mountains, valleys, uninhabited deserts, under the trackless sea, and 10,000 newspapers would prate of it. If he were grievously ill, all the nations would know it before the sun rose again. If he dropped lifeless where he stood, his fall might shake the thrones of half the world. If I could have stolen his coat, I would have done it. When I meet a man like that, I want something to remember him by. As a general thing, we have been shown through palaces by some plush-legged, filigreed flunky or other who charged a franc for it, but after talking with the company half an hour, the Emperor of Russia and his family conducted us all through their mansion themselves. They made no charge. They seemed to take a real pleasure in it. We spent half an hour idling through the palace, admiring the cozy apartments and the rich but eminently homelike appointments of the place, and then the imperial family bade our party a kind good bye and proceeded to count the spoons. An invitation was extended to us to visit the palace of the eldest son, the Crown Prince of Russia. which was near at hand. The young man was absent, but the dukes and countesses and princes went over the premises with us as leisurely as was the case at the Emperor's, and conversation continued as lively as ever. It was a little after 1 o'clock now, and we drove to the Grand Duke Michael's, a mile away, in response to his invitation previously given. We arrived in 20 minutes from the Emperor's. It was a lovely place. The beautiful palace nestles among the grand old groves of the park. The park sits in the lap of the picturesque crags and hills, and both look out upon a breezy ocean. In the park are rustic seats here and there, and secluded nooks. There are dark with shade. There are rivulets of crystal water. There are lakelets with inviting grassy banks. There are glimpses of sparkling cascades through openings in the wilderness of foliage. There are streams of clear water gushing from mimic knots on the trunks of forest trees. There are miniature marble temples perched upon gray old crags. There are airy lookouts whence one might gaze upon a broad expanse of landscape and ocean. The palace is modeled after the choicest forms of Grecian architecture, and its wide colonnades surround a central court that is banked with rare flowers that fill the place with their fragrance, and in their midst springs a fountain that cools the summer air and may possibly breed mosquitoes, but I do not think it does. The Grand Duke and his Duchess came out, and the presentation ceremonies were as simple as they had been at the Emperor's. In a few minutes conversation was under way as before. The Empress appeared in the veranda, and the little Grand Duchess came out into the crowd. They had beaten us there. In a few minutes the Emperor came himself on horseback. It was very pleasant. You can appreciate it if you have ever visited royalty and felt occasionally that possibly you might be wearing out your welcome. Though as a general thing, I believe, royalty is not scrupulous about discharging you when it is done with you. Well, the Grand Duke is the third brother of the Emperor. He is about 37 years old, perhaps, and is the princeliest figure in Russia. He's even taller than the Czar, as straight as an Indian, and bears himself like one of those gorgeous knights we read about in the romances of the Crusades. He looks like a great-hearted fellow who would pitch an enemy into the river in a moment and then jump in and risk his life fishing him out again. The stories they tell of him show him to be a brave and generous nature. He must have been desirous of proving that Americans were welcome guests in the imperial palaces of Russia, because he rode all the way from Yalta and escorted our procession to the Emperor's himself, and kept his aides scurrying about, clearing the road and offering assistance wherever it could be needed. We were rather familiar with him then, because we did not know who he was. We recognized him now, and appreciated the friendly spirit that prompted him to do us a favor that any other Grand Duke in the world would have doubtless declined to do. We had plenty of servitors whom he could have sent, but he chose to attend to the matter himself. Oh, the Grand Duke was dressed in the handsome and showy uniform of a Cossack officer. The Grand Duchess had on a white alpaca robe with the seams and gores trimmed with a black barb lace, and a little gray hat with a feather of the same color. She is young, rather pretty, modest, and unpretending, and full of winning politeness. Our party walked all through the house, and then the nobility escorted them all over the grounds and finally brought them back to the palace about half past 2 o'clock to breakfast. They called it breakfast, but we would have called it luncheon. It consisted of two kinds of wine, tea, bread, cheese, and cold meats, and was served on center tables in the reception room and the verandas, anywhere that was convenient. There was no ceremony. It was a sort of picnic. I had heard before that we were to breakfast there, but Blucher said he believed Baker's boy had suggested it to His Imperial Highness. I think not, though it would have been like him. Baker's boy is the famine breeder of the ship. He's always hungry. They say he goes about the staterooms when the passengers are out and eats up all the soap. They say he eats oakum. They say he will eat anything he can get between meals, but he prefers oakum. He does not like oakum for dinner, but he likes it for a lunch at odd hours or anything that way. It makes him very disagreeable because it makes his breath bad and keeps his teeth all stuck up with tar. Baker's boy may have suggested the breakfast, but I hope he did not. It went off well, anyway. The illustrious host moved about from place to place and helped to destroy the provisions and keep the conversation lively. And the Grand Duchess talked with the veranda parties and such as had satisfied their appetites, and straggled out from the reception room. The Grand Duke's tea was delicious. They give one a lemon to squeeze into it, or iced milk if he prefers it. The former is best. This tea is brought overland from China. It injures the article to transport it by sea. When it was time to go, we bade our distinguished hosts good bye, and they retired happy and contented to their apartments to count their spoons. We had spent the best part of half a day in the home of royalty, and had been as cheerful and comfortable all the time as we could have been in the ship. I would as soon have thought about being cheerful in Abraham's bosom as in the palace of an emperor. I supposed that emperors were terrible people. I thought they never did anything but wear magnificent crowns and red velvet dressing gowns with dabs of wool sewed on them in spots, and sit on thrones and scowl at the flunkies and the people in the parquet, and order dukes and duchesses off to execution. I find, however, that when one is so fortunate as to get behind the scenes and see them at home and in the privacy of their firesides, they are strangely like common mortals. They are pleasanter to look upon then than they are in their theatrical aspect. It seems to come as natural to them to dress and act like other people as it is to put a friend's cedar pencil in your pocket when you are done using it. But I can never have any confidence in the tinsel kings of the theatre after this. It will be a great loss. I used to take such a thrilling pleasure in them, but hereafter I will turn me sadly away and say, this does not answer. This isn't the style of the king that I am acquainted with. When they swagger around the stage in jeweled crowns and splendid robes, I shall feel bound to observe that all the emperors that ever I was personally acquainted with wore the commonest sorts of clothes and did not swagger. And when they come on the stage, attended by a vast bodyguard of supes and helmets and tin breastplates, it will be my duty as well as my pleasure to inform the ignorant that no crowned head of my acquaintance has a soldier anywhere about his house or his person. Possibly it may be thought that our party tarried too long or did other improper things, but such was not the case. The company felt that they were occupying an unusually responsible position and were representing the people of America, not the government, and therefore they were careful to do their best to perform their high mission with credit. On the other hand, the imperial families, no doubt, considered that in entertaining us they were more especially entertaining the people of America than they could by showering attentions on a whole platoon of ministers, plenipotentiaries, and therefore they gave to the event its fullest significance as an expression of goodwill and friendly feeling toward the entire country. We took the kindnesses we received as attentions thus directed, of course, and not to ourselves as a party, that we felt a personal pride in being received as the representatives of a nation. We do not deny that we felt a national pride in the warm cordiality of that reception. Cannot be doubted. Our poet has been rigidly suppressed. From the time we let go the anchor, when it was announced that we were going to visit the Emperor of Russia, the fountains of his great deep were broken up, and he rained ineffable bosh for 24 hours. Our original anxiety as to what we were going to do with ourselves was suddenly transformed into anxiety about what we were going to do with our poet. The problem was solved at last. Two alternatives were offered him. He must either swear a dreadful oath that he would not issue a line of his poetry while he was in the Czar's dominions, or else remain under guard on board the ship until we were safe at Constantinople again. He fought the dilemma long, but yielded at last. It was a great deliverance. Perhaps the savage reader would like a specimen of his style. I do not mean this term to be offensive. I only use it because the gentle reader has been used so often that any change from it cannot but be refreshing. Save us and sanctify us, and finally, then, we see good provisions we enjoy while we journey to Jerusalem. For so man proposes, which is most true, and time will wait for none nor for us too. Well, the sea has been unusually rough all day. However, we have had a lively time of it. We've had quite a run of visitors. The Governor General came, and we received him with a salute of 9 guns. He brought his family with him. I observed that carpets were spread from the pierhead to his carriage for him to walk on, though I have seen him walk there without any carpet when he was not on business. I thought maybe he had what the accidental insurance people might call an extra hazardous polish (policy joke, but not above mediocrity) on his boots, and wished to protect them. But I examined and could not see that they were blackened any better than usual. It may have been that he had forgotten his carpet before, but he did not have it with him, anyhow. He was an exceedingly pleasant old gentleman. We all liked him, especially Blucher. When he went away, Blucher invited him to come again and fetch his carpet along. Prince Dolgorouki and a Grand Admiral or two, whom we had seen yesterday at the reception, came on board also. I was a little distant with these parties at first, because when I have been visiting emperors I do not like to be too familiar with people I only know by reputation, whose moral characters and standing in society I can not be thoroughly acquainted with. I judged it best to be a little offish at first. I said to myself, princes and counts and grand admirals are all very well, but they are not emperors. and one cannot be too particular about who he associates with. Baron Wrangel came also. He used to be the Russian ambassador at Washington. I told him I had an uncle who fell down a shaft and broke himself in two as much as a year before that. That was a falsehood, but then I was not going to let any man eclipse me on surprising adventures, merely for the want of a little invention. The Baron is a fine man, and is said to stand high in the Emperor's confidence and esteem. Baron Ungern Sternberg, a boisterous, whole-souled old nobleman, came with the rest. He's a man of progress and enterprise, a representative man of the age. He is the chief director of the railway system of Russia, a sort of railroad king. In his line, he is making things move along in this country as he traveled extensively in America. He says he has tried convict labor on his railroads, and with perfect success. He said the convicts work well and are quiet and peaceable. He observed that he employs nearly 10,000 of them now. This appeared to be another call on my resources. I was equal to the emergency. I said we had 80,000 convicts employed on the railways in America, and all of them under sentence of death for murder in the first degree. That closed him out. We had General Todtleben, the famous defender of Sebastopol during the siege, and many inferior army and also navy officers, and a number of unofficial Russian ladies and gentlemen. Naturally, a champagne luncheon was in order, and was accomplished without loss of life. Toasts and jokes were discharged freely, but no speeches were made save one, thanking the Emperor and the Grand Duke, through the Governor General, for our hospitable reception, and one by the Governor General in reply, in which he returned the Emperor's thanks for the speech, etc., etc.